Hey everybody, Donald again with Scales Upscaled. This is Aegon, our blue-eyed leucistic male ball python who you met in our last video. Today he's going to be helping me explain a little bit more of a deep dive into recessive genes and different morphs, different things you can do with those, as well as get into specifics and a deeper dive into our first project. We'd like to show some examples and what we hope our end goal will be with that project. So first, let's introduce a couple of the breeders in that project. You've met her before. This is Lucia. Although she looks normal, she is what is called heterozygous, or het for short, for two different genes that we'll get into examples here in a minute. And this is her soon-to-be mate, Tenebrax. He is also het for those same two genes. He looks a little bit different right now because he's actually in blue getting ready to shed, and you can especially tell that by his eyes, how they're grayed out and everything. But regarding the heterozygous genes, so a recessive gene, again what we're covering today, you have to have two copies, one from each parent in one particular snake to be visual representation of that gene. There are different genes that aren't heterozygous, like Aegon here is a good example. He's got a few different genes, but lesser being the primary ones. He's got two copies of lesser, which makes him all white. We'll get into that in a later video on the incomplete dominant genes, which is what those are, as well as other dominant genes. But for today, we're sticking with recessive. So one of the recessive genes that Lucia and Tenebrax both carry is piebald. You've seen this before, probably 100 times, one of the coolest looking snakes that you can probably imagine. The piebald gene lightens the colors where there are colors in the snake, as well as gives those white patches in between, kind of separating the colors into islands. Piebald can have different expressions, more white or less white, sometimes hardly any white at all, sometimes almost completely white, similar to Aegon here. Piebald is a really cool and popular gene, and there's a whole lot of different things you could combine with it to get really cool different morphs. The second gene that Lucia and Tenebrax are both het for is exanthic. There are different lines of exanthic that aren't compatible genetically, but they all have in common is that they sort of reduce the yellows and browns in the coloration of the snake. While you will have some browns sometimes coming through, oftentimes you'll see a more muted kind of grayscale black and white snake. Now the goal of our project is not just to get pieds, is not just to get exanthics, but to combine the two eventually between Lucia, Tenebrax, and their offspring, as well as another female we'll be getting here shortly. And the result of all that is a lightning pied. Lightning pied is, to me, the best of both worlds. You get the whites from the piebald, as well as the lightning colors and the exanthic black and white. Really, really cool looking snake in my opinion. And although that's the end goal of the current phase of that project, we have further plans to bring other genes into the lightning pied project. That's actually what it's kind of nicknamed, lightning pied, is the exanthic piebald. But yeah, we want to bring some other different pattern altering genes as well as some color altering genes into that project. Something we'll touch upon in a later date when we sort of get more genes in our breeders. But for now, that's sort of what we want to do with that project, with these couple breeders that we've showed you before. Of course, Aegon here is in a different project altogether, being with incomplete dominant genes. We'll cover that in more detail at a later time. But we have had some questions along the way as to how exactly it works breeding the snakes with the different genes, and how you can calculate odds on what you're going to see in the babies as far as morphs and whatnot. So we're going to break that down a bit today. We're going to go back to all high school biology here with a Punnett square. Now, this is going to show you at the very top of the square and on the left side of the square, you'll see an example of genes from two different parents. So you can see, we're going to use piebald as an example here. The top parent and the left parent are both heterozygous, or het, for piebald, and Lucia and Tenebrax are a good example. They carry one of two genes needed for piebald to become visual. So although they carry one gene, they don't look piebald themselves, which explains why they look normal. So you can see the sort of different odds on distributing these genes. So in the upper left corner, you'll have, if both parents were to pass on that piebald gene to their offspring, that that snake would be visually piebald. It would have two copies, one from each parent, and it would look just like a piebald like we saw earlier. In the top right and bottom left square, you'll see if one parent were to pass on piebald but the other were to just pass on the normal gene, that offspring would, just like Tenebrax and Lucia, be het for piebald. They would carry one copy of the gene, but they themselves would not look visual for piebald. And in the bottom right corner you have, if they were to both not pass on the piebald gene, they just pass on the normal gene, you're going to get a normal snake with not carrying the gene whatsoever. So this is a pretty simple example of how you could calculate the percentages of the offspring you're going to get. So in the instance of being het for piebald, again like Lucia and Tenebrax, you can see that they have a 25% chance of making an offspring that is visual for piebald. They have a 50% chance in the upper right plus the bottom left of having an offspring that is not visually piebald but does carry the gene. And then in the bottom right, that's another 25% chance of having a normal offspring that does not carry the gene. So it can get quite a lot more complicated when you're talking about trying to bring in other genes in addition to just the one. So to get a little bit more deeper in, I'm not going to chart this out or anything, but in the case of our Lightning Pied project, since we have two breeders that are both het for two different genes and we want both of those genes to be visual, you can see like the piebald alone we have a 25% chance of hitting. But we also, in the same kind of setup here, we have the same chances of hitting the 25% for exanthic. So theoretically, statistically, 25% of their babies should be piebald and 25% of their babies should be exanthic. Now the tricky part is kind of where those numbers overlap. You know, if you want to do the math, technically it's like 25% of 25% is the chance we have of hitting Lightning Pied from just those two, which is like a 6.25%. I'm not going to work out all the math, but I just want to kind of show how challenging it is to hit off those particular breeders. Now you can increase the odds of hitting any particular morph by having a parent, again, that has two copies of that gene. So if either, let's say Tenebrax, let's say he was piebald, you could see he looked piebald, you could see the white on him, that would mean he has two copies of the piebald gene. So while Lucia has a 50-50 chance of passing on the piebald, he would have a 100% chance because he's got two copies of the gene and one of those has to be passed on. So in that way you can increase your odds, kind of manipulate the morphs that the babies are going to have and what you're going to see in your hatchling. So that's sort of, again, what we're going to be doing for the Bell project, since Aegon here is super lesser, he's got two copies of the lesser gene, he is guaranteed to pass on a lesser gene to all of his offspring. So in that way, we'll show you in a later video sort of how we're playing the odds in that, and we're going to produce more babies that look just like him. In any case, there are, we've kind of talked before, there are some different morphs that pose a hazard, a health hazard or a threat to the well-being of the animals. I will go back to using spider as an example. So spider is an incomplete dominant gene, meaning that it will be visual on a ball python if you have just one copy of the gene rather than needing two like a recessive. However, if you were to breed a spider ball python to another spider ball python, any of their offspring that has two copies of that spider gene are potentially going to pass away, unfortunately. It is a potentially lethal combination, which is one of the reasons we're choosing not to work with genes like that, even though you could sort of avoid that by only having one copy in just one parent, and we don't want to take the risk and potentially cause any harm or bring any animals into this world that won't last long. So but yeah, so that sort of covers it. I know it can get a little bit complicated, particularly when talking about multiple genes and different recessive versus incomplete dominant. We'll get into those in a little bit greater detail in a future video, but that's a summary of it, and I just wanted to show you our first project, the Lightning Pied. So we would absolutely love to know what you think about the Lightning Pied project now that we're kind of showing you what direction we're headed with it. What do you think about the piebald with the exanthic combination? Do you like how it comes out as just black and white, and do you like the pattern, or would you like to see something else kind of worked in there? Would you like to see piebald with maybe a different color, or lightning pied with maybe like a pinstripe pattern or something? We really want to know. We're definitely open to taking feedback on where we go from here. We want our audience and our community to help drive some of the interest in our project. So let us know below. And as always, thank you so much for watching, and we will see you next time.